Some people risked everything to save a few dollars. It ended badly. Fact 1. A man in England decided that paying for professional tree work was an unnecessary expense. After all, why hire experts when you own a ladder and a chainsaw? The tree in question stood close to power lines, and removing it professionally would have cost a few $100s. Determined to save the money, he climbed the ladder himself and began cutting branches. Witnesses later reported that one branch shifted unexpectedly and made contact with an overhead electrical line. The resulting electric shock was catastrophic. Emergency crews arrived quickly, but there was nothing they could do. Investigators later concluded that the entire tragedy stemmed from an attempt to avoid the cost of hiring qualified workers. It's one of those stories that sounds painfully obvious afterward. A few $100s seemed expensive that morning. By evening, it had become the most expensive discount imaginable. Sometimes the cheapest option carries a price tag nobody sees until it's too late. Fact 2. In South Africa, a man reportedly entered an old abandoned mine searching for leftover gold deposits. Illegal mining has long attracted people hoping to strike it rich without spending money on permits, equipment, or proper safety measures. The logic is always similar. Why pay for access when abandoned tunnels might still contain valuable ore? Unfortunately, abandoned mines are abandoned for reasons that usually include collapsing walls, unstable shafts, toxic air, and flooding risks. During one such expedition, part of the tunnel gave way. Rescue efforts were complicated by the dangerous conditions underground, and the victim never made it out alive. The cruel irony was that he entered the mine hoping to gain money while avoiding legitimate costs associated with mining. Instead, the mine claimed another life. Nature has a habit of ignoring financial shortcuts. Underground rock doesn't care whether someone is saving $5 or chasing $5 million. Gravity charges the same price either way. Fact 3. A man in the United States was attempting to repair the roof of his home without purchasing proper safety equipment. Roofing harnesses, anchors, and protective gear would have added extra cost to the project, and he believed he could finish the job carefully enough without them. For a while, that assumption appeared correct. He worked across the roof carrying materials and tools, making steady progress. Then, one misstep changed everything. According to reports, he lost his footing near the edge and fell several stories to the ground below. Emergency responders arrived, but the injuries were severe. The tragedy became another example of a surprisingly common pattern. People often calculate the cost of safety gear, but rarely calculate the value of the risk they're accepting. The harness may have seemed expensive while standing in the hardware store aisle. Looking back, it was probably the cheapest thing on the entire project. Sometimes the item people decide not to buy turns out to be the only thing they truly needed. Fact 4. A homeowner in the United States decided that calling a licensed electrician would cost too much. The problem seemed simple: a faulty electrical panel in the basement. Online videos made the repair look easy, and hiring a professional would have cost several $100s. Armed with a few tools and confidence far greater than his experience, he opened the panel and began working on live wiring. Investigators later determined that he never shut off the main power supply. At some point, he touched an energized component carrying enough voltage to stop a human heart instantly. Family members found him shortly afterward. Electrical accidents happen in seconds, but the decision that causes them often begins days earlier while comparing prices. The cruel reality is that electricity never negotiates. It doesn't care whether someone is experienced, careful, or trying to save money. In this case, avoiding one service bill ultimately cost far more than anyone could ever afford. Fact 5. In Australia, a man attempted to recover a dropped item from the roof of a commercial building rather than paying for proper access equipment. The object itself wasn't especially valuable, but he disliked the idea of spending money on professional help. Instead, he climbed onto the roof using an improvised route that was never designed for safe access. Witnesses later reported seeing him walking near fragile roofing material, commonly found on industrial buildings. These surfaces often look solid from above while hiding dangerous weaknesses underneath. At some point, the roofing gave way beneath him. He fell through the structure and suffered fatal injuries. Investigators noted that safety equipment and professional access methods would likely have prevented the accident entirely. It's a tragic reminder that people often focus on the cost they can see while ignoring the risk they cannot. Saving money feels rewarding until the hidden bill arrives without warning. Fact 6. A fisherman in the United Kingdom wanted to avoid paying docking fees at a nearby marina. The charges weren't enormous, but he believed he could save money by securing his small boat in a less expensive location farther from official facilities. Unfortunately, that area lacked proper maintenance and safety infrastructure. One evening, deteriorating conditions forced him to check on the vessel during rough weather. Witnesses reported strong winds, poor visibility, and dangerous water conditions. While attempting to secure equipment and prevent damage to the boat, he fell into the water. Rescue crews launched a search, but the combination of darkness and harsh conditions made survival unlikely. The investigation highlighted a painful irony. The marina fees he wanted to avoid existed partly to provide safer mooring locations and emergency support. What began as a simple effort to keep a little extra money ended with a risk far greater than the original expense ever justified. Fact 7. In Germany, a man chose to cross active railway tracks rather than purchase a train ticket that would have allowed him to reach the opposite platform legally. The station offered a safe route using designated pedestrian access, but that option required paying for transportation. Determined to save a small amount of money, he attempted a shortcut across the tracks instead. Witnesses later stated that he appeared focused on reaching the other side quickly and may not have fully appreciated how fast modern trains approach. Railway operators consistently warn that judging speed and distance near tracks is extremely difficult. Tragically, those warnings proved true. The train operator had little time to react, and the collision was fatal. Investigators found no mystery behind the incident. There was no mechanical failure or extraordinary circumstance, just a decision driven by saving a modest amount of money. Sometimes the shortest route becomes the longest mistake a person ever makes. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. We're curious to see how far our videos travel around the world. Fact 8. A man in the United States was known among friends as someone who hated paying professionals for anything. When his chimney required cleaning, he refused to hire a service company despite repeated recommendations. Professional chimney maintenance would have cost relatively little, but he believed he could do the job himself using homemade equipment. Climbing onto the roof, he began working near the chimney opening without proper fall protection. Conditions were worse than they appeared. Soot buildup, unstable footing, and the steep roof created a dangerous combination. At some point during the process, he lost his balance and fell. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were fatal. The tragedy struck neighbors particularly hard because the entire situation had been preventable. The amount of money he hoped to save was insignificant compared to the risk involved. Yet that's often how these stories begin. Nobody thinks they're gambling with their life. They think they're saving a few dollars. Fact 9. A farmer in the Midwest owned an aging grain bin that needed professional maintenance. The repair estimate wasn't outrageous, but he believed he could handle the issue himself and avoid spending the money. Grain bins can be deceptively dangerous. From the outside, they look like simple storage structures. Inside, however, grain behaves almost like quicksand when machinery is operating. One afternoon, he entered the bin while grain was being moved, hoping to break up a blockage without shutting down the equipment. Within seconds, the flowing grain pulled him downward. Witnesses immediately called for help, but grain entrapment is one of the fastest and most unforgiving accidents in agriculture. Rescue teams arrived quickly, yet the situation became impossible to reverse. Investigators later emphasized that professional procedures require equipment shutdowns and safety systems for exactly this reason. The repair bill he wanted to avoid was measured in hundreds of dollars. The risk he accepted was immeasurable. Fact 10. In a coastal town, a recreational diver decided not to pay for a licensed charter trip to a popular offshore wreck site. Charter operators charged a fee because the location was difficult to reach safely and required experienced supervision. Wanting to save money, he and a friend borrowed a small boat and attempted the trip themselves. Conditions initially seemed perfect. Calm water, clear skies, and excellent visibility created a false sense of security. But offshore environments can change rapidly. During the dive, a strong current developed around the wreck, pushing divers farther from their boat than expected. Experienced operators knew how to anticipate these conditions, which was one reason the charters existed in the first place. By the time trouble became obvious, valuable minutes had been lost. Rescue efforts followed, but the diver never returned safely. A modest charter fee suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the price paid for avoiding it. Fact 11. A homeowner decided to remove a large dead tree from his property rather than pay a professional crew. Tree removal can be surprisingly expensive, especially when heavy branches hang near homes, power lines, or neighboring structures. Looking at the estimate, he convinced himself the contractors were charging too much for a job that seemed straightforward. Armed with rented equipment and confidence, he began cutting major limbs from the upper section of the tree. Unfortunately, experienced arborists spend years learning how weight shifts during cuts. One branch fell differently than expected, striking part of the trunk and creating a chain reaction. The tree moved suddenly and violently. Witnesses later described the event as happening almost instantly. Emergency responders arrived, but the injuries proved fatal. The tragedy highlighted a lesson professionals understand well. When gravity, weight, and momentum combine, even small miscalculations become deadly. Sometimes expertise costs money because mistakes cost everything. Fact 12. A man living near a busy river routinely crossed it using an unofficial route, rather than paying a small toll at a nearby bridge. Friends had warned him that the shortcut became dangerous during periods of heavy rain, but he had successfully used it many times before. Familiarity often creates confidence, and confidence can disguise risk. After a storm raised water levels, he again chose the shortcut. The toll would have cost only a few dollars, and the official crossing remained open and safe. Yet he believed he could save both time and money by following the route he always used. Conditions beneath the surface had changed dramatically. Strong currents were hidden by murky water, and footing became unstable. When trouble began, there was little opportunity to recover. Rescue teams searched the area, but the outcome was tragic. A fee that once felt unnecessary suddenly looked like the cheapest insurance policy imaginable. Fact 13. A vehicle owner noticed that his car's braking system was developing serious problems. Mechanics inspected the vehicle and recommended immediate repairs, explaining that several critical components were badly worn. The estimate was frustratingly expensive, and he decided to postpone the work. Instead, he continued driving while searching for cheaper alternatives and temporary fixes. For weeks, nothing happened. The car still moved, stopped, and seemed reliable enough. That false sense of normality convinced him the warnings had been exaggerated. Then, while traveling on a busy roadway, the failing system finally reached its limit. Investigators later determined that a critical brake component malfunctioned when it was needed most. The resulting crash proved fatal. Friends later recalled how often he discussed saving money by delaying the repair. Ironically, the mechanics had never been selling a repair. They had been selling time. Unfortunately, he only realized that after time had already run out. Fact 14. A hunter in a remote area of Alaska decided against renting emergency communication equipment before heading into the wilderness. The rental fee seemed unnecessary. After all, he had made similar trips before and considered himself experienced enough to handle any situation. The problem with wilderness emergencies is that they rarely announce themselves in advance. During the trip, changing weather conditions created difficulties far from the nearest road. What began as a manageable situation gradually became a survival emergency. Search teams later discovered evidence showing he had attempted to make his way back toward civilization but lacked any reliable way to call for assistance. Investigators noted that a rented satellite communication device would have cost only a small amount compared to the overall expense of the trip. Instead, rescuers were never alerted until it was too late. The most tragic part was how preventable it appeared. A modest precaution had been viewed as an unnecessary expense until circumstances proved otherwise. Fact 15. A homeowner noticed signs of a gas leak around an older appliance. Several people advised him to contact professionals immediately, but he hesitated after learning the inspection and repair costs. Hoping to save money, he began searching for ways to diagnose the problem himself. Natural gas can be deceptive. A small leak may seem harmless until the right conditions allow danger to accumulate quietly over time. According to investigators, he attempted adjustments without fully understanding the system involved. At some point, a concentration of gas reached a critical level inside the structure. The resulting explosion caused devastating damage and fatal injuries. Neighbors later described hearing a blast that shook nearby homes. Safety experts emphasize that gas systems are among the least forgiving areas for do-it-yourself repairs. Unlike a leaking faucet or a squeaky door, mistakes often provide no second chance. The service call he wanted to avoid suddenly became the cheapest option he never chose. Fact 16. A man regularly commuted across a large body of water using a commercial ferry service. The ticket price wasn't especially high, but over time he became convinced he could save money by making the journey in a small personal craft instead. Friends questioned the idea because the route crossed busy waters known for rapidly changing conditions. Nevertheless, he viewed the ferry fee as an unnecessary expense repeated too many times. One day, weather forecasts predicted worsening conditions, yet he chose the cheaper option again. Experienced ferry operators adjusted routes and procedures accordingly, but a small vessel offered far less protection. During the crossing, rough water created difficulties that quickly escalated beyond what he anticipated. Rescue efforts were launched after he failed to arrive. Investigators later pointed out that the ferry ticket covered far more than transportation. It paid for professional crews, safety equipment, weather monitoring, and experience. Those hidden services became painfully visible only afterward. Fact 17. A car owner discovered that one of his tires had suffered significant damage and needed replacement. The recommendation from a repair shop seemed straightforward, but he disliked the idea of spending money on a new tire when the old one still appeared usable. Instead, he chose a temporary repair and continued driving. For weeks, the decision seemed justified. The vehicle operated normally, reinforcing his belief that the shop had been overly cautious. Unfortunately, tires endure tremendous stress at highway speeds, and internal damage isn't always visible from the outside. While traveling on a busy interstate, the weakened tire failed catastrophically. Witnesses reported the vehicle suddenly losing stability before leaving the roadway. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the crash proved fatal. Investigators found no mystery behind the event. The damaged tire had simply reached the point experts had warned about earlier. The replacement he wanted to avoid purchasing eventually became the most expensive item he never bought. Fact 18. In an attempt to avoid paying storage fees, a man decided to keep large quantities of fuel and other flammable materials inside a residential garage. Renting proper storage space would have cost money each month, and he considered the expense unnecessary. Over time, the collection grew. Containers accumulated in corners, near tools, electrical equipment, and other potential ignition sources. To neighbors, it looked cluttered. To safety experts, it would have looked like a disaster waiting patiently for its moment. Investigators later determined that a fire started inside the structure and spread with extraordinary speed due to the stored materials. The conditions became far more dangerous than a typical residential fire, leaving little opportunity for escape. Fire officials emphasize that regulations surrounding hazardous storage exist because tragedies like this have occurred repeatedly throughout history. The monthly fees he worked so hard to avoid were designed to reduce exactly this type of risk. Unfortunately, that lesson arrived far too late. Fact 19. A man living near a popular ski destination wanted to avoid paying for an official lift ticket. The price frustrated him, especially because he planned only a short trip onto the mountain. Rather than use designated routes monitored by ski patrol, he chose to hike into a restricted backcountry area and access the slopes from there. At first, the plan seemed successful. He bypassed ticket checkpoints and enjoyed terrain that appeared untouched and peaceful. What he underestimated was how much work goes into making ski areas safe. Avalanche monitoring, hazard marking, and emergency response teams are expensive for a reason. Later that day, changing snow conditions created a dangerous situation beyond the boundaries of the managed resort. When trouble developed, there were no nearby patrols and no immediate assistance. Rescue teams eventually located him, but the outcome was tragic. The lift ticket had never been paying for a ride uphill. It had been paying for a safety system. Fact 20. A homeowner discovered signs of serious termite activity beneath part of his property. Pest control specialists recommended treatment as soon as possible, warning that structural damage could worsen rapidly. The estimate seemed expensive, and he decided to postpone the work while searching for cheaper alternatives. Months passed. The house appeared normal from the outside, reinforcing the belief that the professionals had exaggerated the threat. Unfortunately, termites are remarkably effective at hiding destruction until critical support structures become dangerously weakened. One day, while working in an area affected by long-term damage, part of the structure failed unexpectedly. Investigators later determined that extensive deterioration had compromised the building's integrity far beyond what was visible. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries were fatal. Experts noted that termite treatment often feels costly because the damage remains invisible. In reality, homeowners are usually paying to prevent future disaster. In this case, that future arrived before the repairs ever did. Fact 21. A recreational boater decided not to purchase a personal flotation device before heading onto a large lake. He considered himself a strong swimmer and viewed the expense as unnecessary. After all, life jackets seemed designed for inexperienced people or children, not someone who had spent years around water. During the outing, weather conditions shifted faster than expected. Strong winds created rougher waves, and a minor problem with the vessel quickly became more serious. Witnesses reported that he entered the water unexpectedly. Even excellent swimmers can struggle when cold temperatures, fatigue, and rough conditions combine. Rescue teams later emphasized a common misconception. Drowning incidents often involve experienced individuals who believe their skills can replace safety equipment. The life jacket he declined to buy would have cost less than a tank of fuel. Instead, a simple outing became a tragedy. Confidence can be valuable on the water, but it is never a substitute for flotation. Fact 22. A man regularly used an aging space heater in his home because replacing the unit seemed like an unnecessary expense. The heater showed obvious signs of wear, occasionally produced unusual odors, and sometimes operated inconsistently. Friends suggested buying a newer model, but he preferred saving the money. After all, the old heater still worked most of the time. Unfortunately, electrical devices often provide warnings long before failure. According to investigators, the heater eventually malfunctioned during use, creating conditions that led to a rapidly spreading fire. By the time smoke alarms activated, the situation had escalated dramatically. Emergency crews responded, but the fire moved through the structure with devastating speed. The investigation concluded that the aging appliance was the likely source of ignition. Safety experts later noted that replacing the heater would have cost only a fraction of what was ultimately lost. Sometimes people focus on extending the life of an old product while unknowingly shortening their margin of safety. Fact 23. A traveler visiting a foreign country decided to save money by avoiding licensed transportation services. Official taxis charged more than informal alternatives operating nearby. Looking at the price difference, he chose the cheaper option without much hesitation. The vehicle appeared functional, and the decision seemed harmless. What he didn't know was that licensed operators were required to meet safety standards, maintain vehicles properly, and follow regulated procedures. During the journey, mechanical problems developed that should have been addressed long before the vehicle entered service. Investigators later found evidence of serious maintenance issues that contributed to a catastrophic accident. The tragedy highlighted an uncomfortable truth about bargain decisions. Sometimes the extra money isn't paying for luxury or convenience. It's paying for inspections, regulations, training, and accountability. Those protections often remain invisible until something goes wrong. In this case, the difference between the expensive ride and the cheap ride was measured in far more than dollars. Fact 24. A property owner refused repeated recommendations to remove a dangerously damaged retaining wall. Engineers had inspected the structure and warned that repairs were necessary. The estimates were substantial, and he disliked the idea of spending so much money on something that appeared to be standing perfectly fine. From a distance, the wall looked stable enough. Beneath the surface, however, years of pressure and deterioration had weakened critical sections. Experts explained that failure could occur suddenly, especially after periods of heavy rain. Hoping to avoid the expense, he delayed action again and again. Then the warning became reality. Investigators later determined that a major collapse occurred when conditions exceeded what the weakened structure could withstand. The event unfolded with little warning and catastrophic force. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the outcome was fatal. The engineers had never been selling concrete, stone, or construction work. They had been selling prevention. Unfortunately, prevention always seems expensive until disaster provides its own estimate. Fact 25. A man who frequently hiked in remote desert regions decided against purchasing a satellite emergency beacon before a solo trip. The device cost several $100s, and he viewed it as an unnecessary gadget marketed to overly cautious adventurers. After all, he had completed similar trips for years without major problems. During the hike, however, an unexpected injury left him stranded far from established trails. The environment that had seemed beautiful and peaceful quickly became unforgiving. Desert temperatures climbed during the day, water supplies dwindled, and the nearest help was miles away. Search teams later discovered evidence that he had attempted to continue moving despite worsening conditions. Investigators noted that a beacon could have transmitted his location within minutes and dramatically improved rescue chances. Instead, valuable time disappeared. Ironically, the equipment he considered too expensive cost less than many hikers spend on boots, backpacks, or camping gear. The cheapest item on the packing list was the one he left behind. Fact 26. A homeowner noticed that a section of his roof had begun showing signs of serious deterioration. Contractors inspected the damage and recommended immediate repairs, warning that water intrusion could weaken structural components hidden beneath the surface. The estimates were significant, and he decided to postpone the work until a later season. For months, nothing dramatic happened. Rainstorms came and went, and the house remained standing. That apparent stability reinforced his belief that the contractors had exaggerated the urgency. Unfortunately, water damage often works slowly and invisibly. Over time, supporting materials weakened far beyond what was visible from below. During a period of severe weather, part of the compromised structure failed unexpectedly. Emergency responders arrived after the collapse, but the outcome was tragic. Investigators later concluded that the original repair recommendations would likely have prevented the disaster. The roof repair seemed expensive at the time. In hindsight, it was one of the cheapest investments he never made. Fact 27. A fisherman decided to save money by using an old life raft that had not been professionally inspected or serviced for years. Marine safety experts recommend regular maintenance because emergency equipment often sits unused for long periods while slowly deteriorating. The inspection fee seemed unnecessary to him. Why spend money checking something that appeared perfectly fine? During an offshore trip, mechanical problems forced him into a genuine emergency situation. When the time came to rely on the raft, it failed to function as expected. Investigators later determined that age and neglected maintenance had compromised critical components. Friends recalled that he often joked about companies charging unnecessary fees for inspections and certifications. Tragically, those procedures existed precisely because emergency equipment is rarely tested until lives depend on it. The inspection he skipped would have cost a relatively small amount compared to the overall expense of boating. Unfortunately, the first real test of the equipment became its last. Fact 28. A property owner attempted to clear an old well on his land without hiring specialists. The well had become blocked, and professional services quoted a price he considered excessive for what seemed like a straightforward task. What he failed to appreciate was that confined spaces present unique dangers invisible from the surface. Wells can accumulate toxic gases, suffer from oxygen depletion, or contain unstable conditions that change rapidly. Determined to avoid the cost, he began working alone. At some point during the process, trouble developed below ground. Rescue teams faced extraordinary challenges because confined space emergencies are among the most dangerous situations first responders encounter. Investigators later emphasized that specialized training and equipment exist for exactly these environments. The task itself wasn't complicated, the environment was. What began as an effort to save money on professional assistance became a tragedy that safety experts say has repeated itself countless times throughout history whenever hidden hazards are underestimated. Fact 29. A driver owned a vehicle equipped with severely worn tires and repeatedly postponed replacing them because he disliked spending money on maintenance. Friends, mechanics, and even family members mentioned the issue, but he always found another expense that seemed more important. The tires still held air, the car still moved, and that was enough to justify waiting a little longer. Then came a day of heavy rain. Investigators later determined that the tires had lost much of their ability to channel water away from the road surface. At highway speed, the vehicle began hydroplaning. Witnesses described a sudden loss of control that left almost no opportunity for recovery. Emergency crews responded immediately, but the crash proved fatal. Experts often describe tires as the most important safety component on any vehicle because they are the only part touching the road. In this case, the replacement he delayed wasn't really a purchase. It was a decision about risk, disguised as a shopping choice. Fact 30. A homeowner noticed that the wooden deck attached to his house had begun showing signs of age. Boards felt softer than before, railings moved slightly under pressure, and several neighbors suggested having the structure professionally inspected. The inspection fee seemed unnecessary. After all, the deck was still standing, and replacing damaged sections would cost even more. For years, he delayed both inspection and repairs. What he couldn't see was the gradual deterioration hidden beneath the surface, where moisture had weakened critical supports. During a gathering, the aging structure finally reached its limit. Investigators later determined that long-term decay had compromised key load-bearing components. The collapse happened suddenly, leaving little warning. Emergency responders arrived quickly, but the injuries proved fatal. Experts noted that structural inspections often feel like money spent on nothing because their success is invisible. In reality, they identify problems before gravity does. Unfortunately, gravity eventually performed its own inspection free of charge. Fact 31. A man who frequently traveled through mountainous areas disliked paying for roadside assistance coverage. Every year the membership renewal arrived, and every year he considered it wasted money. His vehicle was older but reliable enough, and he believed he could handle most problems himself. During a winter trip through a remote region, mechanical trouble left him stranded far from nearby services. Temperatures dropped rapidly after sunset, and road traffic became almost non-existent. Without professional assistance immediately available, what began as an inconvenience slowly evolved into a survival situation. Search teams later discovered that help had been available had he possessed the coverage and communication resources he routinely declined. Investigators emphasized that remote environments can transform minor vehicle failures into life-threatening emergencies with surprising speed. The membership fee he viewed as unnecessary represented only a tiny fraction of his travel expenses. Yet, it was the one expense specifically designed for the exact emergency he encountered. Fact 32. A property owner attempted to save money by handling septic system maintenance without hiring qualified professionals. The system had shown warning signs for months, including drainage problems and unusual odors. Specialists recommended a full inspection and repairs, but the estimate seemed difficult to justify. Determined to solve the issue himself, he began working around the system using improvised methods and limited equipment. Septic systems can contain dangerous gases that are largely invisible and often underestimated by people unfamiliar with them. Investigators later determined that conditions developed rapidly during the maintenance attempt. Rescue efforts became especially difficult because confined spaces and toxic atmospheres create hazards not only for victims but also for responders. Safety experts stress that professional procedures exist because these incidents have occurred repeatedly over decades. The money saved by avoiding expert assistance amounted to very little in the broader picture. The risks involved, however, were far larger than they appeared from ground level. Fact 33. A sailor preparing for a long coastal voyage decided against replacing several outdated safety devices aboard his vessel. Emergency beacons, signaling equipment, and other critical systems were nearing the end of their recommended service life, but replacing them would cost more than he wanted to spend. Since the equipment had never been needed before, he assumed it would continue functioning if an emergency ever occurred. Unfortunately, that assumption was eventually tested. During rough conditions far from shore, a serious incident left him dependent on the very equipment he had chosen not to update. Investigators later found evidence suggesting that multiple safety systems either failed or performed below expected standards. Search efforts continued for an extended period before authorities pieced together what had happened. Maritime experts often describe safety equipment as something people hope never to use, which makes spending money on it feel frustrating. Yet the value of emergency gear begins precisely when everything else has already gone wrong. Which story shocked you most, and what's the cheapest mistake you'd never risk making?